Water shapes our world. Life as we know it cannot exist without water, at least not for an extended period of time. And yet too much water can be an impediment to survival as well. Water management is critical to sustainable, healthy landscapes, particularly in an increasingly challenging environment. Ben Franklin once said, "If you fail to plan, you are planning to fail." Well, the same is true of water management. Poor water management leads to declining landscapes, higher expenses, and potentially lost business. But don't worry, our experts are here to help.
Hi, I'm Mark Jackson, Water Management Consultant for the Navy Institute. In this 5-part series, Water Specialists will share with you how water impacts the landscapes that we care for. Join us and discover water use efficiency methods that will help improve your landscape while actually using less water. So today we're going to be talking about water management. Does it really matter to steward our water? Does it really make a difference? Well, on the surface, if you're actually talking about the truth in horticultural water management, that the landscape and the turf industry places a very high priority on appearance. But the question is, at what cost to the environment in water waste? Well, our wonderful government, the EPA, estimates that as much as 50% of the water applied to landscapes is lost or wasted. And that was in 2015 and 2017, so that if that is true then, it's probably even more true now. In fact, it's all due to, as they reported, to runoff from slopes, overwatering and watering unnecessarily. And of course, the big one is design issues. So how we're going to attack that and to think about water efficiency and how it really matters, we're going to talk about the water storyline for plant health care. We're going to talk about, in today's session, why water and what is water management and what it's not. We're going to talk about something that's often ignored, and it's the plant, soil, water, horticultural continuum, which is very science-based, but we usually aren't aware. We're going to talk a little bit about soils, talk about some plant microclimates, and really what affects the roots of what really matters to keep plants healthy. We're going to talk about some water savings tips, and of course, some case studies of water management that we've actually done. We'll look at a couple what's and some whys and some hows. And here's our series goal, is to create some awareness and understanding of how water works and in some, hopefully, some new and refreshing ways for you as you tune into us through the whole series. So how does water really work? Well, according to horticulture, there is a plant, soil, water continuum that affects our landscapes. But like I said earlier, we're not really aware. But let's look at, and how does water really play a part? How does that really work? And in reality, irrigation systems should be supplying supplemental water to the soil for root uptake. Might be a different concept for everybody. Supplemental water. What does that really mean? We'll discuss that a little bit as we go forward here. And of course, what role does soil play? It really basically is the water and nutrient reservoir. So when you put this all together from a biological perspective concerning water, it's all connected. Plant, soil, and water coexist. In fact, in the soil, they coexist together. And that is the only place all three of those actually coexist. And reality is it's not possible to manage one without affecting the other two. So why discuss soil when we are concerned about water? Because soil is the major controlling factor when it comes to plant health care. And the reason it is because the question is, are all soils created the same? Of course not. If you were trying to wet a sponge, it'd be certainly different than trying to wet and keep wet a brick. But the reality is that a bunch of our plants are growing in these type of soils. And in fact, in the same landscape under the same plants, we often find different soils. But when we see this scenario right here, without really knowing what the soil is, because we might have two different types, we just keep watering. That attributes to the EPA report of 50% of water waste because we just water whether it needs it or not. So let's look at a refocused approach to water management. Let's look at a holistic management concept. And the concept is that the plant, soil, water coexist in a continuum. And since it does, if you modify one, you're going to affect the other two. And water management is more than repairing leaks and broken sprinklers. It's basically science-based and performance-driven from the root up. And we look at the root causes when we look at water management. And we really need to shift our mindset from irrigation services to water management. Here's a good way to think about it. Water managers focus on horticulture, not hardware, and they manage it from the soil and the roots upward. Why? Why would we want to look at it like that when it comes to plant health care? Well, it's because we want for the plants to gain sustainability. But the reality is we really can't see, nor do we know what's going on in the soil. So water management, think of it this way, since it's horticulturally based, it's a lot like this picture here that I took in a functional medicine office that I went to get my COVID-19 test of all things. So I snapped this picture and really thought this is a good explanation, the difference between water management and irrigation services. The functional medicine people will find out why you have a headache and a rash on your arm and not just give you something to make both go away. They'll actually find out what's causing it, and that is water management. What's really causing the issues of non-plant health versus irrigation services would look at this picture and go, sprinklers are working. The way I can solve that problem is everything's working. I'll shut the sprinklers off for a day and everything will be fine. Well, is that really true? Quite frankly, a lot of times the water stays in the soil for 2 or 3 days, especially if you have a heavy clay soil and you don't really need to turn the water back on, which contributes to that 50% of waste. In irrigation services, which just looks at the hardware, it says, well, all of these sprinklers are functioning properly, but look at all the water that's going into the asphalt and the slopes. The question is, how long are those running? Might not be changed by the irrigator, but by the horticulturist, going to make sure that all the water that's applied goes into the soil, not into the street. Here's water management tip savings number 1. Once again, irrigation should be thought about as a supplemental tool in water management. The system should be replenishing the soil profile with water, not watering the plant material. The plants don't know what to do with the water themselves. They take it from the soil. In other words, plants know what to do when interfaced with the soil, but you need to know the soil before you can irrigate accurately. Why? Once again, because the soil under all these different plants aren't all the same, and the soil controls it, which makes the health of the plant look vibrant or look declining. So the real key is, how can I manage upkeep and create sustainable water management strategies? How can I get the right plant in the right place in the right soil? Well, it's really great to do it by design. So if I'm doing it by design, and even if it's post installation, what does a sustainable landscape actually mean for water management? Here's a good definition. The sustainable landscapes are water use efficient landscapes that reduce or eliminate the need for supplemental irrigation. In other words, only what the plant actually needs. Irrigators will focus on repairing and installing the hardware, like we had some illustrations before, but not horticultural science to determine the watering needs. In other words, let's look at below the strategy. Let's look below the surface to obtain our strategies. And here's a good way to think about it. The typical irrigation delivery system, especially a pop-up that everybody thinks is efficient, puts out almost 2 inches of water per hour. But if my soil, and I'm going to the more porous ones, only takes in a half an inch or up to 1 inch, what is automatically happening with my delivery rate? I'm putting down at least twice as much as the soil can take in. And if I'm putting down twice as much as the soil can take in, what happens to it? It's a waste. So the question is, do they align? And here's a good way to think about it. Let's add a slope to our issue of watering. And the infiltration cannot take the water in as fast as it can deliver it into the soil. So if I'm trying to water this tree on the slope, it's not going into the soil, it's running down the hill into the runoff or the street or a puddle, as we saw in the previous illustrations, which adds to water waste. So what's really going on below the surface? Here's an example of what I just explained. Here's a typical tree that's watered with a bubbler. Very good idea for a tree that's new and needs some initial watering methods, but I wouldn't water it next to the trunk. Where are all the roots? The bubblers should be out here where the roots are, especially as it expands and it grows, but yet this one still remains at the base of the trunk where the least amount of meaty roots are that needs to soak up water. But really what's happening is Here's that tree to the left. The bubbler is watering every one of these, while the pop-up sprinklers are putting down almost 2 inches of water per hour, are more than watering this tree. So when we run into these scenarios, what we recommend is turn off the bubblers. They're not even needed. It's just water waste. And more than likely, turn down the time running on the pop-ups or put in a sprinkler head that doesn't deliver it with such great amounts of water. So what's another strategy we can look at? What we like to think about it as a holistic look is water management audit is basically not an irrigation system audit. It's the right plant with the right soil, with the right amount of water. But how do I get to that? How can I create a proactive water management plan so I'm using the water properly for my microclimates, my soil, my plants, and keeping the plant health care viable? Well, we look at the irrigation and the soils. We look at the drainage in the soils. Soils is the major factor, as we said. We look at the plant needs. And of course, we look at the water supply. We put all those together to come up with a water management plan that's best for that site, for those microenvironments. And what's some anticipated results of a water management audit? Typical savings are 30 to 50% of water. There's less strain on your natural resources, and it saves on repair parts because you're using your system less. And you can use these improvements and put them into an ROI that comes with recommendations, and you put it into a yearly planned budget. And of course, soil management strategies, which are data-driven from our approach by using scientific equipment out on site to determine that soil, so we know exactly what that soil can do. And then we put that together in what we call precision watering for the site based upon the data that was taken from the water management audit. And here's why that's all important. Here's what you're trying to do is to create roots that are deep, which are in oxygen rich soils, which are called aerobic. We don't want anaerobic soils created, which happens because we overwater. What we want to do is be able to monitor it. In reality, what we're trying to do is always keep 25% air, which creates these kinds of roots, with 25% water, not too much water. If we can't monitor the water in the soil, we generally overwater. And if we overwater the soil, what's really happening? The air gets pushed out of the root zone and it creates anaerobic or unhealthy conditions, which creates less roots. And since we can't see below the ground, we need some extra help by some technology. And here's a key point, that irrigators ignore the soils, what's happening in the soil with our water, and specific plant watering needs, and they blanket water the flora equally. So how can I really tell that and see below ground? One simple idea to think about is use soil moisture sensors, or SMS. If you use a soil moisture sensor compared to any other kind of devices to monitor and water your landscape, according to the University of Florida research, you're going to save an additional 20 to 40% of water just by monitoring the soil versus any other way. Water savings tip number 3. As you can see, poor water use, we've said over and over, is not really thinking about how all these plants are different in this scenario. And if you look real close into that picture, you'll actually see that water's just flying everywhere. So the plants are not considered. They're all kind of thinking it's the same. The soil's all the same. Microclimates are all thought about the same. And the soils aren't even thought about. So water is running off and being wasted. But the reality is that plant coefficient standards really can help us to water these more efficiently. But the real important part is if you can design and put the efficiency into the system instead of blanket watering all the same, it will save at least 50% of water. What we usually find is a whole lot more. Another project that we did in Tennessee, by putting in these soil monitor mechanisms, and we used it at 2 different levels. We made it to be remote, and we stopped the water from going down the drain and changed things around. And this is still being put in, but the projected is 50% plus of water savings and actually healthier plants. So here's a question, what we found on one site. Is this hardware or horticulture? If you notice, this plant's dead. This plant's pretty healthy. Not so good, not so good. And if you go down the line, plants get healthier and healthier. Well, here's really what has been happening. That if it looks bad, we're typically have trained ourselves, just need more water, add more water, increase the time, need more water. Well, the reality is this one has a broken head that you can't see behind it. And as it leaks, it just bubbles out, floods this plant, and the water in the soil makes it drain this way. But that plant, no matter how much you water it, is just going to keep dying. This way, you need to fix the hardware. But if you looked at the symptom, you would say it needs more water. Here's another example of an HOA that we did in Florida. We did a bunch of readings from our mobile device, and all these readings should be in the green. So we started managing the system to be in the green, which also matches the chart that I showed on the previous slide to equal these kinds of water content to be in the soil. And you don't have to memorize what's the right number if you know the color. So that's why we did it. But the colors do match per soil, the right amount of air content in the soil. It can all be calibrated per your type of soil. So here's a final summary. What does the water management and conservation actually look at in total to monitor the soil moisture is key. And there's some helpful tools to use for that. And I would suggest that those are used more than trying to guess from looking at the symptoms of the plants. And we also learned that precipitation rate must not exceed soil infiltration rates. Adequate soil oxygen produces more roots, and irrigation repairs to leaks is not water management. We also learned that in our short time here. Managing the soil is the savior of your Florida, not fixing hardware. And increased roots promote plant sustainability. Why? Because it increases your root depth, and you can only have root depth increase if there's enough oxygen supplied in the soil that the plants can grow the roots into. And of course, a water management audit provides a complete data to facilitate business decisions towards improved water conservation and plant health care management.